There was another video I was gonna make today. I've been thinking about it all day, but something just occurred to me that I had to make sure I made note of, which is because supposedly, and it's very supposedly, supposedly back in the day, people thought it was a flat Earth. Then we thought it was a round Earth. And all along, we thought the Earth was the center of things, even though there were those philosophers, astrologers, theologians, gurus that kind of knew better, you know. And we harsh on the idea or the insanity of epicycles, right? Never mind the fact, because the story among those who decry the math and philosophy of the past are like, oh, they kept the Earth the center of the universe and relied upon epicycles to describe the motions of the planets. No. For thousands of years, the astronomers and mathematicians documented and noted the apparent epicyclic or pseudo-epicyclic traversion of the, you know, what is it, the seven unfixed stars through the heavens. The way the planets move through the heavens is epicyclic. They weren't creating epicycles to describe the movement of the heavens. They were noticing what they saw and documenting it, and then using reason to try to understand it, to overstand it. So, even if we say those in the greater camp of Euripides were wrong, the math they both discovered and created, this creative discovery process, was a major innovation. Major. And far exceeds my capacity and most likely yours. Yet we buy into the philosophies that deride that idea because we think something nefarious was being forced upon the truth, when in reality, for those who were thinking and feeling and doing and observing and recording, and then testifying to the best of their knowledge, they saw these epicyclic movements in the heavens and tried to understand them. Inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, reductive reasoning. But anyway, one of the ways we can think of ourselves as cosmological universal beings is that we come from our mom and our dad, and the role of the maternal grandmother is intrinsically connected to the, mitochondrial DNA. So in much of DNA testing, it's relying upon the maternal line, the Russian doll. so to speak, of matriarchal mitochondrial DNA, and the fact that the egg that you, all of us, whether we're man, woman, or hermaphrodite, or whatever among the spectrum, we came from a mother and a father. We came from a sperm and an egg. The sperm, whatever, what we get from our father was made, right? If we're born after 9 months, right? Whatever came from our father may have come from 3 months before that. So at the moment we're born, whatever came from us from our father was from about a year ago, maybe on the lesser side. But from our mother, we get an egg that she was born with, that was born inside of our grandmother. So if we know when our mother was born, we can get a rough idea based on science if we trace that back a little bit. There's a point in a female, in a woman, in a female fetus, there is a date when those eggs are complete, when the number's up, for real. So, if we think of the center of the galaxy as being the center of a circle, because we think of the Earth spinning while going around the sun, right? But then there's also that 25,000 year wobble of the Earth, the Platonic great year, right? But then there's what might otherwise be called the Pythagorean or the Archimedean grand year, which is how long it takes for us to go around, like the galaxy is spinning. So the great year has to do with the wobble of the Earth, kinda. But then the grand year has to do with that traversal of the Earth around the center of the galaxy, which is measured in millions of years, But all that while in space, and that's if we can affix the galaxy, which we can't. But if we affixed the galaxy, and the center of the galaxy as the origin of a kind of grid, then the path of the Earth around the sun, it's this spiral, right? But then the sun is also doing this 25,000 year great year Platonic wobble. So we're rotating while we're revolving. We're revolving while we're rotating. And we're revolving while we're rotating and wobbling and spinning around the center of a galaxy, right? So we're tracing this Etch-a-Sketch spiral thing through time. And there are points. They say a human life is approximately 1 degree of the Platonic great year. It would be a very small fraction of a degree. of the Archimedean grand year, the traversal around the center of the galaxy, right? So we're tracing this like woven interlattice snail shell through space-time. And for mathematicians, it might be interesting to dive into these numbers to determine coordinates, points in the movement of the system that is spinning around a center, that is spinning around a center, that is spinning around a center, you know. When we think of machine tooling, 5 degrees of freedom can do a lot, right? But we ourselves have many more than 5 degrees of freedom. And we're acting out those more than 5 degrees of freedom upon spins with virtually no freedom. So there are magnitudes. There are magnitudes of necessity. There are magnitudes of. There are a priori magnitudes of movement physically in the world that cannot be usurped for all practical purposes. The spinnings upon spinnings upon spinnings upon spinnings. Yet we are on this little itty bitty globe in this vortex, in this vector vortex of vertices, in these vertices of vectoral forces, in these vector vectors. Spinnings on top of spinnings on top of spinnings. And we're on this little globe that in that entire system, if we blow up the system to something, or shrink down that entire galactic system to something we can understand, the Earth is something like smaller than a point. It's invisible. If we take that huge system and collapse it down so we can see it, the Earth is so small we can't even see. But yet there it is, this perfect mathematical physical force, defying. We defy the second law of thermodynamics. We defy it. We push back against it like nothing else. But on that little globe, on that little point that to us seems smaller than a point, which we represent with a dot, and we get confused when we try to understand or conceive that a point is infinitely smaller than a dot. And on that point, which we might consider infinitely smaller than a dot in the galactic system, but which is not, it is the inner infinity. The surface of this Earth is the small, good Hegelian infinity. Because the complexity of its relationships, therefore the complexity of its number, so far exceeds our ability to understand and interact with it, for the most part, that it might as well be infinity. Infinity. So we talk about in mathematics something like the Graham's number, Graham's number, whatever. It's incomprehensible. But with study, one can begin to understand just how large it is. I myself prefer the Wildbergian Z, which is a number that might as well be infinity, but isn't because it's rational. It exists and is incomputable. I prefer that. So how do we know Z? With perfect rational trigonometry, perfect rational universic hyperbolic geometry. Or at least I'm persuaded by that from the Wildbergian perspective. Which is to say, once we understand the infinities of ratios, a subset of the real. And it's a little bit of a farce to call the real numbers real, but we'll allow it. But the Zedian, the Wildbergian, Zedian, practical, pragmatic, pragmaticistic, experiential infinity of a rational number larger than we can comprehend, or that the universe itself can compute or comprehend, because the complexity of its relationships, both in stasis and dynamically, are beyond computation, because it would require more complexity to compute than the complexity required for it to be at all. So far as the numbers go. But the mythos gets it right away. The story gets it right away. So what's interesting to me about the way we come to be in this world, and this has everything to do with Meri, and the exaltation of Meri, and the misunderstanding of Meri, and what we call Meri. God appeared from eternity to Meri, his most beloved child, and God's most beloved. We have to understand that the name Meri, does come from Egypt. Yes, it comes from Hebrew, but it comes from that Egyptian-Hebrew mix. I might remind you that Miriam in the Bible of the Old Testament is not the most lovable figure, especially in her disregard of Moses' Ethiopian wife. Right? Remember that. Miriam, Meri, from unknown origins, so the Strong's Concordance says, or at least so I've read. Meri, M-E-R-I, beloved. Strong Concordance and so on, I guess, in the tradition, Hebrew oral tradition. Well, in the Catholic form of it, Meri means the sea of sorrow. Meri, as in maritime. Now's a good time to also clarify that naval law, the law of the sea, does in a sense rule over the law of the land. It's a bigger law, and that commercial interests are maritime interests, and that Commercialism is, the law of the sea. But don't forget that at the end of the day, the sea of sorrow does reign. Meri. To the Catholic tradition, supposedly Meri means sea of sorrow. To the Jewish tradition, supposedly Meri means rebelliousness. But we forget the fact, well, first of all, right after Jesus is born, where's the first fucking place they go? Egypt. While he was wrapped in swaddling cloth. Swaddling cloth are little strips of linen, just like a mummy. So we forget the importance of the greater Mediterranean. We forget the importance that Jesus fulfilled, like, every prophecy through Meri. God from eternity peered at Meri. Meri is God's most perfect creation. People say Jesus is the most perfect creation of God. No. Meri is the most perfect creation of God. Jesus is God incarnate. And for all, right, we live a human life and we look to God. When God was human, if we believe this story. Now, if you don't believe any of this shit, right, then think of it. It's a beautiful, a mind-numbing and crushing thought experiment. If we're willing to talk about Schrodinger's cat, if we're willing to talk about Pavlov's dog, if we are willing to talk about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, if we're willing to talk about these things, as thought experiments, everybody gets them wrong, and they're very naive and infantile in the first place. Though it takes a long time to figure that out. If we're willing to conceive of Schrodinger's cat as a thought experiment, really? Or like the genius of behavioralism or B.F. Skinner or Pavlov, by understanding that when you ring a bell and cut a hole, you can see the saliva come out even though you can feel it yourself if you were paying attention. Why do you gotta cut up a dog? Why do you gotta put a cat in a box? Oh, it's both alive and dead at the same time. No. It's one or the other, absolutely. And when you put a cat in a box, if it's dead, you killed it. And if it's alive, it wants to get the fuck out, and it's your job to get it the fuck out. That's the thought experiment. Put all that other shit aside. That's the thought experiment. And I assure you, I have just come to the proper conclusion. Or, I didn't split the arrow, but I hit the bullseye. Okay. So anyway, for mathematicians or physicists or sociologists, it might be an interesting project to discover the harmonies, both as it relates, because there are solar harmonies as far as the place where, because depending on how old your mother is, how old your grandmother is, how old your father is, when you were born, when the sperm for you was created in time, when the egg for you was created in your mom, inside your grandmother, in time. If we consider the earth spinning around the sun, and the sun wobbling, and going around the galaxy, like, if we consider the center of the galaxy the origin, if we even just considering that, right, you can actually begin to discover geometric harmonics. You might be dealing with crazy fractions so far as radial degrees are concerned. Right? That's why it might be beneficial to also study it solarly, where it's more of a mod system, but degrees of mod. Or if you're looking at like I to nth powers. So there's positions on the circle, but it depends when you get there. So you're talking about frame rates and all that kind of thing. But the specific geometry between when you were formed in your dad's nutsack and when you were formed in your mother's belly, in your grandmother's belly. The exact space on the planet where that happened, on the exact dates, in the exact places in the solar system and in the galactic system. That actually does triangulate a geometry. And that is very interesting. And inside of that, there's all kinds of harmonics. So one of the ways... So I guess, yeah, a few things. Like, infinity might not be infinity. It just might be a number bigger than we can... Like, all of existence might just simply be a number that is larger than we can conceive, which might as well. It's a practical, pragmatic, or pragmaticistic infinity. And that to understand that very large number that might as well be infinity, there's no way to do it unless it's also harmonic, and then we can study harmonics. Harmonic scales, harmonic structures, harmonic sounds, harmonic spatial conditions, harmonic movements. Beauty, structure, or order, unfoldings. And that's a way to understand what might as well be the infinite. And then, yeah, the other thing is just that recognition of the mother and the grandmother. And understanding that we were actually, half of us was actually created inside of our grandmother. And that even before our mother was born, a piece of us lived with her. Even before our mother was born, half of what I am was born when my mother was born, and lived with her, inside of her, every single day of her life until the day I was born, and has lived with me in my life every day since. Who was there when Jesus was born? When Jesus was born in the fucking food trough water bin for sacrificial lambs? Who was there? What's the first thing he saw? Meri. And when he died, at 33, what was the last thing he saw? Meri. And as it so happens, Meri and Meri. So if you're into Jesus, he said, follow me, right? But just remember. Oh yeah, and Meri, and yeah, if I didn't mention it, it must be mentioned much more. Meri in Egyptian means beloved. Beloved. And he was wrapped in that swaddling cloth, even born as already having been a resurrection of the 18th dynasty. And not in a bad way. In the only good way that there is in that whole fucking 2,500 year story. I shouldn't say the only, but the pinnacle. People don't realize Jesus satisfies Egypt. Cleopatra dies. 30 years go on. And then Jesus is born. And then 30 years go on. And Christianity is born. Jesus killed Jesus fulfilled everything Egypt hoped to be. People don't realize that. Because people don't get the story right. Jesus fulfilled everything that Egypt hoped to be. Meri. Follow me. What's the first thing he saw? What's the first thing when God incarnate saw, if you're into this story? What's the first thing, or into this history, or into this truth? What's the first thing Jesus saw born into the world? Meri, Mom. What's the last thing he saw? Fasting. Dying. Hated. And now, 2,000 years later, the greatest unifying force in the cosmos that we know of. What was the last thing he saw? His mom, his Nana, and what some say was his disciple, what some say was his wife, what I say was his sister. Follow me, he said. What could he count on in this world more than anything? Who was always there from beginning to end, never, ever, ever faltered. Ever. How did God come to know God in this world. Not God's world, our world, God's creation. How did God come to know God? What are the bookends of the life of God inside God's creation? What are the bookends? What's the cover? What's the title page? What's the bibliography? Mary. Mom. In this world, even God can't come to know God without his whole life being sandwiched by Mary. Mary was always there. In this world, God never knew a world. God never knew a moment without Mary. In this world, Mary was always there.